going to speak to you about today is, like some of my other colleagues who I believe have spoken on this forum before, share some thoughts and ideas on the very comprehensive scope of diplomacy in recognizing and pursuing India's interests worldwide as a responsible member of the international community while taking care of our national interests. And I was delighted to hear that you have these programs, Dr. Suresh. And I certainly hope some of you will plan a career either in diplomacy or national security. There are many opportunities today that did not exist before. And I would certainly make a plug for all of you trying to join the Foreign Service. I'm also very happy to hear of the kind of work that your center has done in the area of maritime security, because I'm talking to an informed audience then. What I'm going to speak about is really a practitioner's view after almost 40 years of dealing with some aspect or the other of India's maritime interests and security. And I will scope my remarks in four parts. One is concepts based on geography. Two, significant features that arise from the geographical realities. Thirdly, the issues for India and flowing from that, India's policy choices. It's a very vast subject and time is limited. I certainly hope to try to give you a comprehensive view. I will touch on major aspects and we can discuss further details during the Q&A. I am available to you for as long as you want, but I understand you might have scheduling issues as well. Now, from time to time, I will share with you some slides which will then make my point. To start with, the concepts based on geography. If I were to pose a question, perhaps less to a coastal state like Kerala, but generally, let us say, to an informed audience in Delhi about where India's frontiers lie, the tendency will be to mention the land borders, whether or not they are settled, including our longest land border, which incidentally is neither Pakistan nor China, but with Bangladesh. Uh, what does not get spoken about is, as Dr. Suresh mentioned, our entire coastline of 7,500, 616.6 kilometers, according to the Survey of India and the NIO. This is a frontier. It constitutes approximately one third of our external frontiers. And to that extent, is a major strategic aspect of India's security. This includes the coastline of the landmass and of our islands, which tended to be forgotten but are now increasingly recognized for their strategic importance. Just off the coast of Kerala, you have Lakshadweep and Minicoy, and in the middle of the Bay of Bengal, in fact, somewhat nearer to Thailand, you have the Andaman and the Nicobar Islands. So this is one aspect. The coastline is a frontier. The other is the reality of who India's neighbors are. Again, the tendency is to think of our land neighbors, our territorial neighbors, and Sri Lanka and Maldives are included because they are as proximate as they are. But I would really like to point out that many of our neighbors by both land and sea, as you will see from the slide that I will try to bring up. Now, here you see a tally of India's 11 neighbors. And I have two columns of the land boundary and the maritime boundary. You will see that with Afghanistan, Bhutan, China, and Nepal, we have only a land boundary. With Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Thailand, and Myanmar, and Indonesia. The common boundaries of land and sea are Bangladesh, Myanmar, Pakistan, and at low tide, Sri Lanka, because you can walk across the islands at low tide on foot. And we have only maritime boundaries with Indonesia, Maldives, and Thailand. And there is a tendency not to recognize Indonesia and Thailand as our neighbors. But the fact is that we have maritime boundaries, settled maritime boundaries with both these countries. And this, I think, makes a major difference to how we view our maritime interests. Now, in addition to this is the size of India's exclusive economic zone as defined under the law of the seas. Now, this is an area of 2.37 million square kilometers. And what I will do now is share this slide with you, if I can find it. Hang on. I'm a little new to presenting, but I'm trying to share how I perceive some of the aspects that we are discussing. Is the slide up for all of you? Hello?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, as you can see, our landmass is, of course, shown in brown, and the exclusive economic zone, where we have exclusive rights to the resources of the seas, whether it's in terms of the continental shelf or the deep sea, is again something that we are yet to fully exploit, but are gradually getting attuned to. Now, flowing from this is my hypothesis, which I think geography validates, that India is a sea-locked country. We've all heard of landlocked countries. Nepal, Bhutan are landlocked countries. They are our neighbors. They have certain rights. But India is a sea-locked country in that we do not have access post-independence to any countries beyond our territorial neighbors for a variety of reasons. I'm not getting into the policy issues involved there, but the fact is that we do not have that transit access. So a wider engagement is necessary by sea. Now, historically, we have had long maritime contacts with Southeast Asia. Some of you might have been to Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam. I think the monuments, the language, the cultural ties that exist are sort of demonstrate really the depth of the contacts that have existed. The Roman Empire has had contacts with peninsular India. There have been long links with the Gulf. It's not just a question of today's relationship with a vast Indian population there, a large part of it from Kerala. But there was a linkage with the Gulf long before oil was discovered. And whenever the oil runs out, I dare say that linkage will continue. We have had linkages with East Africa. I'm not talking about the Gondwana land connection where the west coast of India and the east coast of Africa were joined, but even subsequently, particularly during the colonial times when Indian teachers, Indian railway workers, businessmen went across to Africa, and of course, you have the great tradition of Mahatma Gandhi developing his strategic methods, I should say, in South Africa. And the sea was used also by the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, the French, China, not just today, but if you are to go by what Chinese historians talk about, Admiral Zheng, who I understand even touched Cochin in his perambulations in the Indian Ocean, and now the Americans. So India has had very strong maritime traditions in the past. Some of these moorings were lost during what I call the colonial interregnum, because the British, with their strategic perception of the power of the seas, retained control of the Navy. I mean, we had the Indian Army, but it was always the Royal Navy because they wished to maintain that control. But essentially, this region has seen globalization in today's terms long before it became a buzzword. Now, therefore, the Indian Ocean, atop which India sits, including all the sub-areas of the Arabian Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Bay of Bengal, the Andaman Sea, the Red Sea, have vital interests for India, both regionally and globally. The Indian Ocean itself, I think, given that you have done so much work on maritime issues, the statistics are indicative in terms of how much of the world's container traffic it deals with, over 50%, energy, the number of ships that transit through it every year, over 60,000, has 40% of the world's offshore oil and gas reserves. And there's great diversity in terms of 29 littoral states, 6 island countries, comprising a third of the world's population. So it also provides global strategic connectivity through vital choke points. And there are vital sub-areas around its seas and distinctive areas, each with certain specific local problems. But if you were to look at the Indian Ocean as a whole, a distinctive feature which is unique to India among large countries is that countries like the United States, the USSR, or Russia today had the benefit of 2 coasts, 2 oceans. Whereas with the Indian Ocean, there is no northern exit as there is for the Atlantic and the Pacific. And therefore, I think the strategic engagement that India has had to have has been somewhat different, developing now in recognition of the natural continuum into the Pacific. Hence, the term that is now being used much more widely than before, but still not accepted by all, namely the Indo-Pacific. I think there is a certain logic to it, and I think that by its very nature, demands that India needs to redefine its own concept of its neighborhood, to which I will come a little later. In fact, I've done a separate lecture on it, and if any of you is interested, I would be happy to share it. Now, an outcome of this evolution of the thought of the Indo-Pacific is also that, in actual fact, India looked and acted east long before anybody spoke about a policy in that respect. History has shown us this on any single visit to almost any country in Southeast Asia. Now, the features that arise out of these geographical realities is that the nature of our coastline and of our EEZ requires variegated development and security. Our development interests involve the sustainable development of our fisheries with all the ancillary industries and production that is necessary in terms of boats, in terms of technology, and in terms of processing facilities. Again, something that you in Kerala know so well. Then there is the question of offshore oil and gas. It's not just Bombay High, on which we have ridden now for several decades, but really the comparatively undeveloped aspects of the Godavari Basin and in the Bay of Bengal. And currently also, in terms of frontier technology, the use of seabed minerals. And if we were to just take a look at what has sustained all our coastal states and much of our Indian states over the centuries and millennia, I should say, is trade. The bulk of our trade goes by sea, approximately 90% by volume, 70% by value. All our oil and gas is imported, so shipping plays a major role in terms of our tanker capacities, our refining capacities, the nature of our merchant fleet, our shipbuilding capacities, the development of our ports and the equipment and machinery and human resources required for that, supply lines by rail and road, supporting industries, and our export production and import handling. It really backends into the entire aspect of national development. And of course, our heavy dependence on imported oil and gas is a very major aspect of it, regardless of whether we are talking about the Gulf, from where we have a major section of our imports, and our wider range of sources, including Nigeria, Brazil, the United States, Russia, Venezuela, Angola, and Mozambique. The full use of our EEZ, I think, is a very major aspect that needs to be looked at, because for long we have tended to have a coastal mentality. We are aware of the kind of conflicts, tensions sometimes that fishermen all along our coasts have had with deep sea trawlers, and also of the kind of poaching that used to take place from other countries because India did not use its EEZ in terms of maximizing its catch. When I was posted in San Francisco, I visited the facilities of a tuna brand. Some of you might have heard of it. It's called Sunkist, and visited some of their ships, which were incredible in terms of the facilities that they provided, the ability to stay out in the high seas for months in order to get the best of the tuna catches available. Whereas here in Delhi, when I go looking for Lakshadweep tuna, I have to hunt for it, even though we have the resources available to us. And beyond the natural resources of our coastal and deep sea waters within our EEZ, there is the involvement of 9 of our coastal states in all of these activities, and our marine workers who serve on so many ships all over the world, regardless of what flag they are under. Whether it is people captured by the Somali pirates, whether it is people on cruise ships, and so on. And I find it very interesting that a lot of them, quite apart from the coastal states like Kerala and Goa and Maharashtra, also come from a totally inland and sandy state like Rajasthan. But the employment potential, again, in the marine industry is huge. Then you have the global commons, which go beyond national or regional aspects. At the base of it, of course, is the freedom of navigation, the safety of the sea lanes of communication. But more than that, in today's discussion on climate change, there is the aspect of the monsoon, of tsunami risk, of cyclones. I think most of you would probably be too young to recall that when I was in school in the 50s, if I recall, there was a major project done on the monsoon and how it affected the countries that it sort of visited. And I think today's discussion on climate change really flows from this growing recognition that the weather, meteorology, there are no known boundaries over there. The earth really is something that concerns all of us. Likewise is marine environmental pollution. An oil spill on the high seas can affect our coasts, as we have seen in so many countries, whether it is Alaska or in the Malacca Straits or off our own coasts. And you have the issue of global warming and the almost automatic ecological and human toll that it would take in terms of migration of populations. So given some of these features, what would be the issues for India, and what are our policy choices and outcomes? Now, given India's aspirations today, our political, economic, and social aspirations, I think the first aspect is that we have recognized the need to expand our areas of interest and engagement, which today happen both at the bilateral, then at the regional, as well as at the multilateral level. Now, I think it would be a truism to say that the sea is not a divider, but a connector. Toynbee has this theory that deserts are connectors, and I think the sea in that respect is also a connector. And there are aspects of connectivity which I will come to a little later. The challenge, of course, for India is how do we develop our capacities and our programs to aid national development in terms of trade, in terms of the whole fishing industry, in terms of minerals, particularly oil, in terms of ensuring freedom of navigation, and what is the current discourse with regard to maritime security, a rules-based order. I think the other challenge is how do we develop the capacity to secure ourselves and to defend ourselves, whether we are talking about the coastline, and the Mumbai attacks of 2008 are an example, whether we are talking about the misuse of the EEZ, and here I have in mind the kind of range that the LTTE gave itself during the Civil War, or more recently, as all of you in Kerala know, the killing of our fishermen on the St. Anthony by the 2 Italian Marines. And then you have the cases of piracy on the high seas, whether we're looking at Malacca, where because of concerted cooperation, things have been brought more or less under control, but also in the troubled waters of Somalia and in the Gulf of Oman. All of this, of course, means that measures have to be taken at the national, at the regional, and at the multilateral level for ensuring the capacities and the kind of security that would enable, ultimately, the environment for development that is such a priority in India. What this means is that we need to put an end to what used to be a debate between whether we should have a brown water or a blue water navy. A brown water in the sense of really in terms of a focus on the continental shelf area, blue water in terms of being able to range much further beyond our shores. After all, today, as I think one of the few countries that does operate aircraft carriers, these are considered floating islands and provide a kind of defense. There's a debate about their effectiveness and vulnerability, but the fact of the matter is that India's maritime interests now extend to what has to be termed the Indo-Pacific. And that means that we need to put in place the resources that are required for effective Coast Guard and naval capacities. The other policy outcome naturally has to be the nature of our engagement at the bilateral, the regional, and the multilateral levels. And here I come into this definition of how we need to redefine in our own minds the concept of India's neighborhood. I make a difference between neighbors and neighborhood. With neighbors, it is a linear relationship. You have a boundary, a country is a neighbor. But neighborhood is a spatial concept. And given our aspirations, our economic growth, the kind of services and professionalism that our people deliver in countries all over the world, including something as far out as in one's mind could be considered Mongolia or Chile, I think that India needs to redefine its own mental horizons in terms of its concepts of neighborhood. Now, at the bilateral level, in terms of our immediate neighbors with whom we share boundaries, at the political, the economic, and social levels, we have close links with all our maritime neighbors, bar Pakistan, for reasons that are well known. And this is a subset, really, of the totality of bilateral relations with these countries. I think it's also worth remembering that historically, India has been a security provider of first choice in the wider Indian Ocean region. Whether it has been in Sri Lanka, when Sirimao Bandanayaka faced an uprising in early 1971, in the Maldives, Mauritius, Myanmar from the 1950s, Seychelles, Thailand, where today we do joint patrolling with the Thai Navy in the Andaman Sea, with Malaysia, Singapore, Vietnam, and Japan, where we have provided resources, including for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. I think also that our relationship with the island countries in the Indian Ocean, in terms of Mauritius, in terms of Seychelles, Madagascar, and of course Sri Lanka and the Maldives, that they come from a clarity that India has to sustain friendly relations and not be apologetic about security cooperation. We offer capacity building, equipment, fiscal support, and training facilities, including the use of some of our own professionals in building up their capacities. And in each case, it is an example of the opportunities for India to share its capacities and to establish a comfort level of a kind that would be unthinkable, frankly, if China were to try to do the same with its own close neighbors. At the multilateral level, I believe India was slow to start with in terms of its regional and then multilateral engagement. But today, I could say that it is absolutely full-fledged. And this has been in terms of both as a development and a security partner. Now, let's take a look at India's regional engagement. SAARC, of course, comes to mind, going back to the 1980s, the preliminary meetings leading to the first SAARC summit in 1985. But my own perception is that the concept of South Asia is flawed. Now, why do I say this? Because are we talking about the erstwhile area of the British Raj? Are we talking about, if we talk about South Asia as areas south of a certain latitude, and let's take India's northernmost point as an example, you would then have to factor in many of the Gulf countries, all of Southeast Asia. And I say this because if you try to restrict the regional perception of what India's regional interests are, this is not realistic. And I think it is because of this recognition that over the years, which I have gone into it in great detail in this other lecture that I did on redefining India's neighborhood, but we moved from SAARC to BIMSTEC, what started as Bangladesh, India, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Thailand economic cooperation, but has now been renamed as the Bay of Bengal Initiative, which covers countries around the Bay of Bengal. And then ASEAN. Again, we were hesitant for Cold War misperceptions, I would say, about linking up with them. And ASEAN first was developed with the end of the American alliance system through CETO and CENTO and so on. And when initiatives were sort of made towards India to be associated with it, we were hesitant. But I think that is way behind us, especially with the end of the Cold War. And today, India has absolutely no hesitation in saying that the security architecture for the Indo-Pacific requires the centrality of ASEAN. Now, within ASEAN, you have the ASEAN Regional Forum, which has evolved over several decades, but I think has today raised certain questions as being more of a talk shop than something that delivers. But that has, the ASEAN Forum has expanded into the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting +8, the expanded ASEAN Maritime Forum, and the East Asia Summit, in all of which India is an active member. And you also have the Indian Ocean Regional Association, again, which started out in a somewhat low-key manner, focusing essentially on trade. And as I think all the political leaderships have recognized, you cannot discuss trade and development and investment without also taking into account security. And this is true as well of BRICS. There were, other than the hesitancy that we had in joining hands with ASEAN in the early years, we also hesitated in joining APEC. But today we are knocking at their doors, and at some stage, I think there will be a recognition that India needs to be a member of that on the part of the member countries who had frozen their membership. You have the RCEP, which is sort of a kind of offshoot of Obama's initiative at the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We had reservations on that, partly because of certain hesitancy with regard to open trade. I'm not going to go into the details of it here, but perhaps we can discuss that during the Q&A. The point is that there's a host of policy issues and strategic decisions that were required. And from a very slow start in multilateral engagement, India, I think today has expanded its engagement to all the littoral countries, not just of the Indian Ocean, but of the Indo-Pacific, by which it would mean all of ASEAN, Japan, Korea, and Russia as well. Now, the factor in all of this, of course, is the rise of China and its growing belligerence. Earlier, we used to talk about Chinese assertiveness. I think now it's really a question of belligerence. And the factor with some question marks about the extent of American involvement and commitment to the region, especially if push comes to shove. The fact of the matter is that today, in terms of China's belligerence, India is the only country that has deployed forces and taken casualties in the process. In addition to these multilateral organizations that I mentioned, are also the maritime security cooperation networks. And apart from the engagement with the Indian Ocean Regional Association, you also have the IONS, the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, an initiative of the Indian Navy, which has sought to bring in all interested players in a rule-based relationship. And that rule base, of course, it flows from the UNCLOS, to which India is a signatory. Most recently, we had the formalization of the trilateral cooperation between India, Sri Lanka, and the Maldives. India is a member of RECAP, the Regional Cooperation Agreement on the Combating of Piracy and Armed Robbery against Ships. And, of course, the latest arrival on the scene, again with slow progression, some question marks, is the Quad. What does it represent? Whose interests does it serve? And so on. I personally believe that as long as any country is willing to participate in a responsible manner on the basis of a rules-based order, it qualifies to join this kind of an organization. There are different interpretations of what the Quad represents. Is it an anti-China kind of thing? Russia was very unhappy when it started up, and so on. Is this the new NATO? I'm sure these are questions that some of you are looking at. I do believe that the participants in the Quad, the members of the Quad, also have different interpretations in terms of what its objectives are. But as far as India is concerned, I would really refer you to two keynote speeches that the Prime Minister made. One was in Mauritius, what's called the Sagar speech, and the other was his speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue, both a few years ago. I think you must be quite familiar with them, where essentially India's approach to the inclusive nature of participation in security cooperation was spelt out, while stipulating that there are red lines starting from no unilateral alteration of the status quo. This holds good in terms of what happens at sea, and certainly in terms of our territorial security concerns with regard to both Pakistan and China, holds good on land as well. Now, quite apart from the engagement through these different entities, what are the instruments that we use? At a very basic level, you have the exchange of ship visits. And quite apart from the fact that they are tremendous public relations exercises for India, not just for the Indian Navy or for the Indian Coast Guard, but for India. I was personally witness to INS Mysore, for example, steaming up the Chaupraya to Bangkok. It was an incredible sight. And a ship visit means that it is open to visitors from the host country. We take school children abroad. The sailors come ashore and are hosted by communities in different parts of the country. And it is a tremendous exercise in public engagement in a positive manner. Then there are joint exercises. India exercises jointly with the coast guards of countries which do have coast guards, and of course with the navies, both at a bilateral level and at a regional level. There has been a long-standing exercise called Himal that takes place in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. More recently, we've heard of the Malabar, which India and the United States, then Japan, and most recently Australia have joined as the Quad. And you have the IONS, the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium. There are shared measures for security and for technical expertise. India has great hydrographic capabilities and has done hydrographic surveys with and for many of the littoral countries. We share satellite imagery, particularly with regard to disasters, with regard to tidal things, and also fisheries, because for fishing communities, I think satellite imagery with regard to where the shoals are makes a big difference. Maritime Rescue, where in fact the operation of this multilateral kind of network really provided the first information, I believe, with regard to the shooting that took place of our poor fishermen on the St. Anthony. Then, following the disaster of Malaysia Airlines MH370 flight, there's also the question of air-sea coordination, because apparently the problems that arose of silo functioning between the air rescue people and the naval or the maritime agencies required better coordination. I've spoken about HADR, and here again, I think India's record has been growing significantly. The best example, of course, is the response of India after the tsunami of 2004. But there are many other examples as well, not necessarily just at sea, but also, for example, in Japan after the Fukushima accident, when a team from our National Disaster Authority went across, and training. With some countries, we have closer relations than others. The interoperability agreements that have been signed with the United States, it's a bouquet of agreements, including the General Security of Military Information Agreement of 2002, the Logistics Exchange Agreement of 2016, the Compatibility and Security Agreement of 2018, and most recently the BECA, the Basic Exchange Cooperation Agreement of 2020. None of this means that India and the US are allies. In fact, what is distinctive is that it is a partnership, and both countries are having to learn how to handle a partnership, because an alliance relationship is totally different. I've spoken about ASEAN centrality and UNCLOS, and I will now come to the point about the sea as a connector with regard to connectivity. And here again, this is a major maritime interest, which I have particularly followed over the years, especially once one realized that our neighbors included Thailand and Indonesia. There are multimodal opportunities over here. You might have heard of the trilateral highway that India has worked to develop through Myanmar into Thailand. But at the maritime level, there are two significant opportunities that I think are waiting to be developed. Now, if I can, let me just bring up the map. Okay, are you able to see the Asia map? Hello?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, now you see this little narrow neck of land in southern Thailand. It is known as the Kra Isthmus. And this leads directly to what I believe is the 6-degree channel in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Now, at the time that the Panama Canal or the Suez Canal were thought of, people have also thought of a canal over here in order to bypass the Malacca Straits, because then that would reduce shipping time considerably, take you right across into the Gulf of Thailand, the South China Sea, and into the Pacific Ocean, all of which matter to India because now a major part of our trade with Asia is through these routes, and also to the west coast of the United States. I don't believe that in this day and age a canal across southern Thailand would be acceptable for reasons of cost and the situation in southern Thailand. But I think a land bridge is certainly conceivable, which again has been talked about, but if you were to put in oil pipelines, a road, railways, you could then connect the Bay of Bengal, South China Sea, and Pacific Ocean. Yet another connectivity opportunity, multimodal, would be the town of Dawai, what in the early days used to be called Tavoy in Myanmar, which is connectable with the town of Kanchanaburi in Thailand, which is connected with the port of Bangkok by highway and again gives you an outlet into the Gulf of Thailand, South China Sea, Pacific Ocean. This again, and it would mean connectivity right across the Bay of Bengal and across here. On a smaller scale, what we are working on with Myanmar is the Kaladan project, again multimodal but coastal, which involves the development of Sitwe Port and a linkage up the Kaladan River into southern Mizoram. This would provide connectivity to the easternmost of our northeast states, namely Mizoram, Manipur, Nagaland, and Arunachal Pradesh, because the connectivity through the Chicken Neck is also sometimes erratic owing to either climatic or local factors. And this would reduce the time and costs in terms of providing supplies to these parts of our country. So connectivity, I think, presents great opportunities. It would reduce costs, it would improve alternate supply routes, and I think it would work for India's economic interests. Finally, before I conclude my remarks, and I think we have taken sufficient time in opening the debate, is that while we talk about maritime issues and maritime security, all security is holistic. There is a very strong section of our security community which believes that we need a separate agency for maritime security. The question I ask, and it starts with the kind of local policing that we all know, where people run from one police station to another on grounds of jurisdiction. If there were a murder on either the high tide line or the low tide line of our coast, who's going to deal with it? Is it going to be a maritime agency or is it going to be the local police? You can't really divide the responsibility. Or during the time of the LTT's activities, yes, they used boats to move back and forth, not just between Sri Lanka and India, but right across the Bay of Bengal to Thailand. But they smuggled kerosene, food supplies, and so on. So let's say a boat is confiscated. Do you have a maritime agency that's going to look after it, or is it customs? If there was kerosene smuggling or smuggling of arms, which agency enters the picture? Now, you see, divided responsibility on security creates problems. This was true of 9/11 in the United States, where the FBI and the CIA didn't cooperate. It is true in many cases in India and other countries. Turf battles between security agencies do not serve anybody's interests, including those agencies themselves. It's important to remove the silos, share the information, and only then will security be treated in the holistic manner that it needs to be dealt with. I'm going to conclude over here. I've tried to give you an overview of what I see as India's maritime interests and security concerns, and I'm open to questions on this or any other aspects concerning security of our